Do what thou wilt should be the whole of the law. Welcome, everybody, to our class on the Sepher Yetzirah, which is our next session in Esoteric Antecedents of Thelema. So, we're going to be using a translation that Carrie Seeline and I worked on for Temple Sophia, Babylon, Caledonia, which was our Gnostic Mass temple that we worked on together as our project for about 5 years. And then also we had a Golden Dawn ritual study group. And so part of the paperwork that was associated particularly with the Zealoter grade, the 1=10 grade in our Golden Dawn group, one of the papers that was issued for that was the Sepher Yetzirah. So we created a temple edition or study group edition of the text. And although I did refer to the translation and commentary, which I very highly recommend, by Arya Kaplan of the Sepher Yetzirah, this is kind of the definitive English language version of the text, and a translation from a specifically Jewish Kabbalistic context. I did also look at the translations of the texts that were issued by William Wynne Westcott. There was a version of the Sepher Yetzirah that was passed around inside the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn and was the basis for their own extensive use of this text, which I'll have more to say a little later in the class. Some of the symbolism of the Sepher Yetzirah is fundamental to the neophyte ritual in the Golden Dawn. And then I also looked at Jim Eshelman's translation of the Sepher Yetzirah, which is the standard College of Thelema translation that I used back in the late 90s when I was a student of the College of Thelema with Phyllis Seckler and doing her course 1 and so on. So regarding this text, it's Gershom Scholem thinks that this text is he says it's from the 3rd to 6th centuries. I think it's likely a Roman era text, and it could be from as early as the late 1st century. When I was taking classes at UC Berkeley and the Sepher Yetzirah came up, some of the professors there were willing to say that it could be from as early as the late 1st century, meaning it can be thought of as roughly contemporaneous, if not directly, at least with the era or context of the Corpus Hermeticum, for example. So, and this is important because just as so-called Gnosticism, which refers to a family resemblance between any number of different sects and movements, has a lot of hybridity is going on in that context between Torah religion and traditions of exegesis or culture around Torah religion, and Greco-Roman metaphysics of a specifically Platonic or crypto-Platonic variety. And so there's a sort of conversation that's occurring between these two literary traditions in a context of Roman cosmopolitanism, where pagan, Gentile, and then later Christian and Jewish communities both overlap with each other, but are also separate from each other at the same time. And so there's a cross-cultural conversation that's going on all the way back to antiquity. And I think in any conversation involving the issue of appropriation from a more modern colonial context, that conversation needs to also always occur in a context where we're acknowledging that there's also a rich cultural conversation between these various cultures that kind of goes all the way back, and that we need to have a hermeneutics of suspicion with regards to the category of indigeneity, that this can never be a pure category, that cultures are never closed or fixed or essentializable, that they're always in a conversation with other cultures that surround and interpenetrate them. There's never a fixed, firm boundary between the foreign outsider and the insider of a particular culture. So in the case of the Sepher Yetzirah, it's both a text that is deeply infused with notions of metaphysics that come from Platonism. And so it's itself articulating a kind of engagement with that type of, you could call it ancient esotericism, while at the same time also explicitly and very specifically being a product of a Jewish literary culture that is always in connection and communication with and engagement with the other cultures that surround it, but also remaining never fully assimilated to those cultures as well. So on that subject, just before we jump into the actual text itself, about which I have a lot to say, and I want to just focus particularly on the text itself, and let's go through verse by verse or bit by bit, and then I have things more generally to say about Qabalah, but I'm going to let them kind of emerge from the text itself rather than having a lot of prefatory commentary. But I do want to say something about my own, you could say, qualifications to talk about this text, which has a long history of being used by Gentiles, being used by magicians and esotericists who are not themselves Jewish or from a Jewish family context or having a connection to that community in some kind of immediate or direct sense. I was in a close, non-married, but primary relationship with a Jewish woman for about 7 years. And I lived at her home and with her 2 young adult daughters. And there was observance of a kind of eclectic kind that was going on at the house that I was definitely fully immersed and participating in as a member of the family for a number of years. And I think a lot of the conversation and engagement that I had with Judaism in kind of a primary family-based form. I did go to synagogue a few times, but I wasn't I wasn't participating in Judaism so much at a synagogue level as more as on a level of family observance. But I do think that's really kind of the heart of the tradition in a lot of ways for a lot of Jews. And so the ongoing conversation that I had with my partner, Carrie Seeline, over those years really helped me to understand magical Kabbalistic practices in terms of their Jewish specificity, as well as in the ways that these texts and traditions have also been read and sometimes very richly interpreted in a broader context. And I think it's important to understand that Western esotericism, so-called, has a Jewish component that is always there, all the way back. And so there's a kind the Western esotericism is also a kind of open category that involves a lot of hybridity in it, even though usually and often when we're talking about that category, we mean Christian Gentile esotericism, often specifically thought of in terms of a kind of Christian identity. And that doesn't really begin to change until the Theosophical Society in the 19th century, kind of the late 19th century. It's founded in 1875 in New York and becomes a big deal internationally. But what's important about the Theosophical Society is that it's really the first important large-scale version of Western esotericism that is not Christian. And it included people who were Christian, and there's a kind of orthodoxy that sets in the later Annie Besant and Ledbetter era where the liberal Catholic Church is introduced, and there's a kind of re-Christianization vaguely of theosophy. And then there's anthroposophy, Rudolf Steiner's breakaway, which wanted, again, to be explicitly Christian and rejected Blavatsky's significant ambivalence, I would even say hostility towards Christianity, which is something that Aleister Crowley and Gerald Gardner both perpetuate. And contemporary neo-paganism actually is much more aligned with the non-Christian, even anti-Christian element of the older form of theosophy than even the later theosophically inclined esoteric movements more in the early 20th century. And so what's important about that is that when you're pushing back against Christianity and practicing a kind of magical esotericism, becoming more opening yourself up to a kind of Judaizing element to what you're doing often becomes an option. And this is going on in the Golden Dawn, and this is going on quite explicitly in Thelema. We also need to acknowledge that there are Jews who are directly involved in all of this, who are members of the Golden Dawn, who are often high-ranking participants in these movements and inserting their own Kabbalistic speculation that isn't just Gentiles picking up Kabbalistic texts and then attempting to interpret them and use them, but also people who come from some kind of Jewish background who this is already their own tradition, who are now participating in that conversation. So there isn't a firm line. So for example, in the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which has an extensive Kabbalistic basis to what it's doing. And in fact, in addition to the Zohar, the Sepher Yetzirah is really a primary text. The whole correspondence, magical correspondence system in the Golden Dawn is based on the 32 paths of wisdom, which are the basic system of the Sepher Yetzirah. Mathers and Westcott and Woodman are Gentiles, but Moina Mathers, her maiden name is Bergson. Remember, she's the sister of Henri Bergson, who's the Nobel Prize winning French philosopher. But the Bergsons are French Jews. And so, and in fact, at the very end of Henri Bergson's life, passed away in the sorry, I didn't look this up. But he passed away as the Nazi era was starting, and he was a critic of the anti-Semitism that was reemerging in France during that period, and there were some laws that were passed that he was protesting at the time of his death, and was kind of getting a lot of attention in the press for that. Moina Mathers, who's a primary collaborator with MacGregor Mathers in developing the second order magical system of the Golden Dawn, is a directly Jewish participant in that as well. And then, of course, there are many Jews involved in not only Thelema, but of course Wicca, and whether that's Starhawk or whomever. And also, there's a story that Grady McMurtry and Shireen Morton, Shireen told me this story. They were invited to Starhawk's wedding, and so they show up, and there's all these different flavors of neo-pagan witchcraft there. And Grady's pointing out, oh, those are the radical fairies over there, and those are the Gardnerians over there, and then there's the Alexandrians over there, and then we're the Thelemites showing up, with his entourage. And so everybody's there. They all sit down, and they're expecting a witch, some kind of witch hand fasting or something for a witchcraft ritual. No, she did a straight Jewish wedding. Because that's part of the scene, that's part of the community, and always has been. So anyway, in that spirit, now I want to look at this text. Let me share the screen. Cool. All right. So here's Sepher Yetzirah. It's called the Book of Formation. Remember, Yetzirah is one of the four worlds. Asya, Yetzirah, Bria, and Atziluth. So that's the world of creation, the formative world. And you could think of that a little bit as something like Plato's realm of forms, but it's been given this Kabbalistic spin, and it's going to turn out that the way this works is a little bit different than in Platonism. So we're going to get into that. Dan, could you please read us verse 1 here of chapter 1?
Sure. By 32 mystery paths of wisdom did Yah of Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh Sabaoth, God Eloah of Israel, the living Elohim, King unto the ages, the merciful and gracious El, the exalted one, the dweller in eternity, most high and holy, etch his name in the three aspects of language: cipher, symbol, and story.
Okay, so God creates through language and through the permutation of language, but a little bit in contrast to Genesis, where it has God speak creation into being, and that's a little bit more like the Platonic version, which is characterized by what Jacques Derrida calls a certain phonocentrism. So the oracular voice of the gods is what possesses the creative power. But in the Jewish Qabalah, God writes the world into being. And so it says it'll say in a moment, we'll get to how he inscribed. Let's first say something about the number 32. So 32 is the number value of the word lev, which is lamed bet. Bet has a hard and a soft pronunciation, so it can have a v sound depending on how you pronounce it. It's because it's a so-called double letter. We'll get to that distinction between single and double letters in a moment. So the word lev means like the heart, but in the sense of it being also the seat of the mind. So it's like the heart mind. Ancient peoples thought often that the thinking occurred in the heart. Galen, I think, says that the brain serves to ventilate the blood and has no other function. And the ancient Egyptians also thought the brain didn't do anything. So when they mummified the body, they would put this hook in through the nose and they would pull the brain out and they would throw that out and that wouldn't get preserved. The heart, that was what was important, where the that was the important part. And so that got taken out and put in the canopic jar. Okay, so the word lev, bet, is the first letter of the Torah because it's the letter that begins the word Barashith, meaning in the beginning. So the first verse of Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And then Lamed, bet, Lamed, or rather Lamed bet, is the last letter of the Torah because the last word in the Torah is the word Israel. And that ends with a Lamed. So the 32 paths of wisdom, the number 32 encompasses the whole of the Torah, and that means it encompasses the whole of the universe because there's a kind of symbolic metaphor here because the writing of the Torah by God is analogous to the creation of the universe. And so the Torah symbolically contains all of the universe and mirrors it and vice versa through a kind of symbolic metaphorical magical correspondence. So everything in the universe can be found in Torah and everything in Torah can be found in the universe and vice versa through this kind of sacralizing magical system of correspondences, a way of reading them in conjunction with each other. And then the mediation is observance, is mitzvot that then reunites the separated divine and human dimensions that have been separated in the exile after the destruction of the temple. So then 30. So you see how this Kabbalistic interpretation then is working to establish these relationships. So another thing, Arya Kaplan proposes that the number 32 is also 2 to the 5th power. And so that would be wisdom or hokmah, which is the 2, permutated through the 5 elements, fire, water, earth, and air, and spirit, as the 2 to the 5th power. So that's another way that you could use some numerical interpretation. The word path is netivot, which is the plural of nativ. And this is like it's like a path, but it has the significance of being like a personal or private. It's like your driveway at home that's gated off and is in a public road. That would be a nativ, a path in this sense. It would not. That's as opposed to being a derek, dalet resh kaf, which is a public road. So there's then this other word that refers to like more of like a secret trail or path or personal, a personal route, you could call it, is the specific Hebrew word that's used at this point. So that indicates you could interpret that as meaning implying the esoteric quality of the 32 paths, as opposed to the more exoteric modes of interpretation. And of course, the whole point of this text is that this is a methodology for esoterically interpreting Torah and the elements of Torah, which it's written in the Hebrew language. And so it uses these 22 letters, the Hebrew alphabet, and then these are imbued with magical significance. And then the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet plus the 10 sephirot, which are the 10 primary numbers. So numbers and letters, but remember in Hebrew, letters are also numbers and numbers are also letters. So these are also, again, expressions of just permutations, one direction or the other of each other. But when you combine the 22 with the 10, you get 32. And then these are the like 32 paths, and you can use these to invoke or banish any force. Anything in the universe can be correlated or corresponded metaphorically to these 32 paths or their permutations in some form or another to make either words or other combinations. And then you add tarot cards onto that, and you've got a whole nother symbolic dimension. And so it becomes basically this complete magical system, but it takes writing rather than speech, as it's kind of, there's an innate privileging of writing rather than speech, which is a little bit different than the Greek metaphysical tradition, which, and this is Jacques Derrida's interpretation, famously, of course, in his philosophy. Greek metaphysics privileges specifically the male authoritative voice or speech as a mode for expressing the basically patriarchal function of male authority. And so that becomes metaphysically reified in what Derrida calls phonocentrism. And so what's interesting about this text is that it instead represents a kind of what Derrida calls grammatology, which is a different mode of reading or interpretation in which Jewish literature or modes of reading stand in a kind of excessive or surplus or slightly out of alignment relationship. They're unassimilable in this complex way from Greco-Roman metaphysics, because in a text like we see this here going on in Sepher Yetzirah, there's actually a privileging of writing over speech. And so rather than phonemes being the primary unit of magical invocation with the barbarous names of evocation, where you have these long strings of vowels, in Qabalah, instead it's the sign, the graphic signs of the 22 letters, the written symbols, the talismans of the 22 letters that are the primary level of the basic structure of their esotericism. And so it provides this kind of contrast to this totalizing or unifying dynamic in Greco-Roman metaphysics. And instead in Jewish Qabalah, there's an emphasis on, instead of everything being brought to unity, there's instead this ideal of the permutation of meaning, where the oversignification of the system of sacred writing, the Torah, its ability to have this infinite signification, that's then the way to mediate your spirituality with the world, rather than the Greco-Roman return to the one, to be, as Plotinus says, that you're trying to ascend to be the alone with the alone. And I do want to emphasize that this distinction that I'm drawing isn't like necessarily essentializable or completely totalizable. So both of these literary traditions are also borrowing from each other. In fact, the hybridity becomes quite acute because remember that Greco-Roman civilization is basically culturally overtaken by a kind of hybrid version of Torah religion in the form of Christianity. And so there's even a kind of overriding of pagan religion by this kind of hybrid version of Judaism that then jumps out of Judaism and is then being practiced by Gentiles. And then Alain Badiou defines Christianity. He says Christians are not Jews. I refer to you to his writings for that somewhat interesting interpretation. Let's see, is there anything else I want to say about this passage? No, let's move on to verse 2. Taryn, could you read us that?
10 are the spheres, Sephirot, of no thing, Thelema. 22 are the signs, the foundation, Yesod, of all things. There are 3 mother, 7 double, and 12 single letters.
Okay, great. So the word nothingness is Lima, Bet, Lamed, Yod, Mem, He. And this word occurs only once in the Tanakh, the Hebrew scriptures, and it appears in the book of Job, chapter 26, verse 7, if you want to look it up, which is, and the verse is, he being God, hangs the earth on nothingness. Okay, so the use of this word in this verse is then, of the Sepher Yetzirah, is then also an intertextual reference to the use of this word in the scriptures. Now, Arya Kaplan says the word belima is derived from the word beli, which means without, and then the word ma, which is anything, a what, something. So it's saying it's the word basically means, belima means without anything. So it's basically saying that the 10 Sephirot are of nothingness. Now that's kind of an interesting thing to say, because that's a little bit in contrast to, again, this Greco-Roman notion that the basis of the holy should be a kind of oneness or unity. And here instead we have the idea that there should be a kind of abyssal nothingness, that creation emerges out of through a kind, it inscribes itself onto nothingness. Again, a kind of a different cultural notion here. Now, of course, this is going to be the basis for what Aleister Crowley calls the Kabbalistic zero, which he contrasts with the metaphysical unity as a kind of deeper or higher phase of understanding mystical, you could say, union with God or whatever. The idea is that the knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel, which totalizes the subjectivity of the magician. And then that unification of the self then ecstatically dissolves into a kind of open spaciousness of being, which is called the abyss. And let's jump ahead to verse 5. Dan, could you read verse 5 to us?
The 10 spheres of no thing have 10 vast regions bound unto them, boundless in origin and having no end, an abyss of good and of evil, an abyss of height and of depth, an abyss to the east and to the west, an abyss to the north and to the south. Adonai Yechida, El, the faithful King, rules all these his holy throne forever and ever.
Okay, so the motif of the throne, that's important. We'll get to that in a moment. That's a reference to so-called Merkabah mysticism. We'll get to that in just a sec. But again, we have this reference to a kind of abyss of the universe, which then the world writes itself out of that abyss. It's like it's inscribed on that abyss. And if we look back up to verse 1, it says at the end of that verse, the exalted one, the dweller in eternity, etc., he etched his name in the three aspects of language. So the word etch is the word hakak, het, kuf, and this means to engrave, like you chisel out, like in cuneiform writing. So what's interesting about that is its writing then becomes a kind of erasure, because you're chipping away at what was there before to then reveal this, rather than a kind of addition. So again, this is brings us back to certain motifs in Jacques Derrida's philosophy. And in his philosophy, he has this idea that writing has this function where it overwrites previous writing. And he talks about how being with a capital B, Heidegger's sort of basic concept of the world horizon, stands, he says, Derrida, under erasure. So being is kind of like self-erased in order to become itself. And so then Derrida would then famously go up to the blackboard or whatever, and he'd write the word being and he'd put an X over it. And he'd say, here it is under erasure. And the point is you can still see it written there. It's just, it's got this X over it. So it's been effaced, but you can still read it. And his point being that this is a different way to think. This is this different kind of Kabbalistic mode of thinking about the magical creation of the universe that is an excess to or indifference from Greco-Roman metaphysics, which has this obsession with unity, totalization, totalitarian, bringing everything to this sort of metaphysical unity. And what Derrida and other thinkers are trying to do is use the Jewish literary tradition as a kind of critical alternative to deploy that, to provide a kind of alternative, and therefore to put metaphysics itself under a kind of erasure, which means it doesn't disappear, but it can have this more, we can have this more complex interpretive relationship to it. And then we can have a more, and here I move away from Derrida because Derrida is ultimately anti-hermeneutical. But I'm very much for hermeneutics as a openness to the indefinite and infinite signification of texts as a way to keep the conversation going that is the world, basically, of human beings in a constructive, creative relationship to our shared social reality. within which we move, live, and have our being, with a capital B. So this concept again of etching or engraving, again, this is the idea of writing, kind of grammatology as the basis for esotericism, and a kind of sublimation away from some of these more totalitarian tendencies of the Greek logos, where we can still talk about a kind of logos. Logos just means language, just means words. But we can think of those words in terms of this alternative. I think you could still call it an ontology. Derrida wouldn't want to, but I'm not Derrida, so I don't have to follow his approach. An ontology based on a kind of grammatology of writing, which can then take on these magical hermetic aspects. And then you can see the way that Thelemic magic very richly is based on that, where we have our own holy books as a kind of Torah-like writing. And in fact, the Book of the Law and the holy books themselves are themselves a kind of further Kabbalistic commentary on Torah, aren't they? Because they're constantly, they're a set of these like modernist prose poem citations, like T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland or Ezra Pound's The Cantos, where the Book of the Law consists largely of quotations or paraphrases or allusions to this esoteric intertext that is being resynthesized and reinterpreted in and through the writing of the Book of the Law, where the alleged speech or voice of Aiwass has been overwritten. It stands under erasure of what is in fact the primary mode or basis of the revelation, which is the textuality of the Book of the Law. And that's why all the publications of the text normatively include the handwritten manuscript, because in a sense that is directly the Book of the Law, not the voice of Aiwass, which is, it was there, but it's gone now. And so like God, who's withdrawn from the universe after the destruction of the temple, the locus of the sacred is no longer in heaven, but in the community in exile, which overcomes its exile through mitzvot, which then resacralizes the world. And so God becomes, or the divine rather, becomes present through a kind of absence, rather than that absence necessarily being directly overcome through some kind of metaphysical epiphany, as in the more Greco-Roman modes of theurgy, which we'll get to over the next two classes. So let's see, what do I want to talk about next? Oh yes, 3 mothers, 7 double, and 12 single letters. And it says that in verse 2, which you can see up there on the screen. 10 are the spheres. 22 are the signs. There are 3 mother, 7 double, and 12 single letters. Okay, so these correspond to the 12 signs of the zodiac, the 7 planets, and the 3 base elements, which are then combined to make the 4th element. So fire, water, and air, which when combined together make earth. So earth, the 4th element, is implied by the 3 mother letters. The double letters are called that because these 7 letters have a hard and a soft pronunciation, which is determined how the vowel pointing is when you write them. And so they're called double letters. And then there's these 12, the other letters all just have a single pronunciation. So then they're called either the 12 single letters, and then there's these 3 special mother letters. Let's take a look Yes, let's take a look at that. We'll get back to, I do want to say something about the throne and Hekalo and Merkabah mysticism. But let me do that in just a minute, and let's take a look at chapter 2, verse 1, and the parable of the pan of balance. Taryn, could you read us that verse?
The 22 signs are the foundation, yesod, of all things, 3 mothers, 7 doubles, and 12 singles. The 3 mothers are Aleph, Mem, and Shin, which are air, water, and fire. They are like the scales of a balance, with a pan measuring profit, a pan measuring debt, and the tongue of the balance judging between them. Mem hums, Shin hisses, and Aleph is the silent breath that mediates between them.
Okay, so it's like 2 pans of a balance, water and fire, the 2 directly opposed elements are Mem for water and Shin for fire. And they're like the 2 pans of the balance. And then there's this fulcrum at which balances them out, and that's the Aleph, the silent breath or aspirate. And so this is how, and these can also then be associated with the oscillation of mercy and judgment, of Hesed and Geburah, of Gedulah and Geburah. And so one way of interpreting the national narrative that's in the history books of the Hebrew scriptures is that there's this back and forth between mercy and judgment, where the people of Israel follow the law and then they're rewarded with prosperity. And so that's mercy, loving kindness. They receive the benefits of the law. But then when they go astray and they're not following Torah and they're becoming wicked in the land, right? That's what the text always says, right? They become wicked in the land. And then what happens? Well, then the judgment kicks in. And then they get overrun by foreigners and bad things happen, and the state declines and the kings are bad and so forth. And then there's this oscillation then between the two that's then balanced out by this coming to a point with Aleph. Now that this theme you'll recognize from the neophyte ritual in the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, where there's the 2 pillars in the neophyte hall. These are said to represent the 2 pans of a balance that weigh the heart with the feather of Ma'at in the Hall of Judgment of the Book of the Dead. But that's also an allusion to the Sepher Yetzirah, isn't it? Both of these symbols have been overlapped because, of course, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn is both a Hermetic theurgic and also a Kabbalistic order, because these 2 symbol systems have been merged as they're also overlap with each other in antiquity. So it's not that like the Golden Dawn is coming along and say, hey, we made up this idea that these 2 things can go together. They go together all the way back. Even in this text, which is infused with various Platonic or metaphysical or sorts of ideas. So, and vice versa. So, Dan, I think your mic's on. Did you want to say something or ask a question? Okay, good, thanks. So you have this hybridity in the Golden Dawn, and then of course further in Thelema. But this metaphor of the pans of the balance. And so as the candidate circumambulates the temple, the officers are supposed to visualize the pans oscillating. And then when the candidate comes to the altar in the center and takes the oath, that's when the pans balance or are in equilibrium. And that's also the metaphor of equilibrium in the ritual. You'll remember that the speeches that are recited by the officers concern avoiding extremes of how mercy without action simply abets evil, but severity and judgment without without mercy is destructive and so forth. And so you have to seek the equilibrium between the two. These are the speeches that are given to the candidate as they circumambulate the temple. And again, this is directly drawn from this Kabbalistic text. It's a kind of if I would even go so far as to say it's a kind of halakhic interpretation of a kind of magical observance. So I just wanted to point that out. And just a sec, let me see what else I want to talk about. Well, let's skip that and let's talk a little bit about the throne symbolism, because that's also an intertextual reference. And let's go back to the first page. There's a whole bunch of stuff in this text, and there's never going to be enough time in just the hour and so forth of this class to be able to cover all of this. Okay, verse 6. Dan, could you read us verse 6 here of chapter 1?
The 10 spheres of no thing have the appearance of lightning flash. Their source is unseen and their ending is invisible. The word is in them as they rush forth and return. They speak as from the whirlwind, and returning fall prostrate in adoration before the throne.
Okay, so again, we have the intertextuality of Jewish literature, which again, I want to compare to the fruitfully compare to the intertextuality of the holy books in the Book of the Law as well. There's a kind of mimetic imitation by Crowley of the style of rabbinical discourse. I think that's very explicit in all of his texts, but particularly in the holy books. And this is his own way, I would argue, of incorporating this liminal surplus element of this Kabbalistic magical grammatology, and therefore Crowley's way of pushing it back against the Platonic metaphysical unity, particularly expressed in heteronormativity, so that this kind of interpretive excess, this intertextual surplus dimension, which has this kind of Jewish literary quality, also signifies queerness. Because in a Victorian setting, Jewishness also signifies queerness in a way as well. And so it's not coincidental that Crowley has this close queer relationship with the Jewish man, Victor Neuburg, for example. It's very important in his magical development that these are ways for Crowley to get out of the box of his Gentile, Christian, white space of this totalitarian, metaphysical, Osirian inheritance from Christian Platonism, and try to the event of the Book of the Law is this kind of eruption of this other style of writing that Crowley identifies with what he calls the Kabbalistic zero, and notice it's the Kabbalistic zero. And so he's borrowing from this literary tradition to write his way out of this heteronormative box so that he can open himself up to this other kind of queer magical experience. So again, this intertextuality is indicated in this verse. There's a little digression there, but what I'm referring to in this verse is the phrase, they speak as from the whirlwind and returning fall prostrate in adoration before the throne, which is a paraphrase of Ezekiel chapter 1, verse 14, describing the movement of the 4 living creatures that are about the chariot throne that descends from heaven, and Ezekiel has this vision of it, and they're described as flashing about or moving about, always being in motion like lightning flashing in the air. And again, it's like this idea of the lightning flash that comes creatively out of the abyss. And there's this spark, this moment of creative presencing that comes out of this underlying. So it's a kind of presence through absence. There's this nothingness, this abyss, this abyssal being, and then there's this flash of lightning, and then illumination occurs, and the divine is sacredly present in the present moment, in the practice, in the observance. And so they rush forth and return. Their appearances as a lightning flash. And all of this is an intertextual reference to a particular type of magical practice that's going on in late antiquity that overlaps with the period of the writing of the Sepher Yetzirah, which is called Merkabah mysticism. And it is an attempt to, through ecstatic prayer, the Jewish meditator has their soul detaches from the body and ascends through the heavens, and then comes to these 7 palaces that then you pass through in heaven that are on top of the sphere of the fixed stars. And then you travel through those 7 interior palaces, and then you arrive at a vision of the throne of God. And there's all kinds of dangerous and crazy stuff that can happen as you're trying to do this. And the references to the throne, and there's several of them throughout the Sepher Yetzirah, are a reference to this kind of Kabbalistic magical ascent. And the method of inducing ecstatic trance is to permutate the divine names, and particularly to permutate the letters of the Hebrew alphabet in what's called the 231 gates. And let me show you where that is in this text, because it's one of the important doctrines that's derived, magical methods that's derived from this text. Okay, Taryn, could you read us verse 4 and then also verse 5, which I'll move the screen when we get to that point.
These 22 signs, which are the foundation of all things, he arranged in a circle with 231 gates, and the circle may be turned forward or backward, whether for good or for evil. For there is nothing good greater than delight, oneg, and nothing evil lower than the plague, nega.
And those are the same letters reversed, so it's a word play. Okay, keep going with verse 5 here.
For he permutated, weighed, and transmuted them, each with the others, Aleph with all of them, and all of them with Aleph, and Bet with all of them, and all of them with Bet, and so on. By thus permutating all the signs in pairs, the 231 gates of knowledge are produced. For all that is formed and spoken comes from this one name.
Okay, this is how you make a golem, by the way, is you do this full permutation of the alphabet with itself. And by doing that, you replicate the way that God wrote creation into being, wrote the world into being through the permutation of the 22 letters. But you can do that too. You can permutate the letters. And so by doing that, you can replicate God's creative magical power. And then you too have the same, you become the locus of the divine, and you have these magical powers just like God does. And so the rabbis are always going around having magical powers because they've learned how to permutate the divine name. And this is what the name of the founder of Hasidism, he has this title, the Baal Shem Tov, which means the good master of the name. And the title Baal Shem, which means master of the name is that refers to these magical techniques of knowing the secrets and the means of permutating the letters and also of the various divine names that appear in Torah. There's a whole bunch of different techniques for doing this that allow you to have different magical effects. And it also alters your state of consciousness when you do this, because you're concentrating and then you go into an ecstatic trance, and then your soul separates for your body. And what's interesting is that this technique is called descending to the chariot. For some reason, it's not clear why, because it seems to be a mystical ascent. But again, there's always this kind of weird variance with the Greco-Roman tradition. So if they say ascent, the Jewish texts have to say, no, we're descending. You see, are they speaking? We're writing. Are they doing this? We're doing that. Okay, so again, there's this interplay between that's very interpretively useful between these two traditions, where they're talking about the same thing, but they're talking about it in different ways. It's very useful. Anyway, this is a primary magical technique that's in the Golden Dawn tradition as well. Bill Heydrich has some interesting things to say about this technique in his work, The Road to the Sun, which I highly recommend. It's been available for many years online. We're coming up on 3, so I want to open for questions in a moment. Again, there's always more stuff to talk about. There's always more stuff to talk about in these texts, but let's open to questions, and maybe we can get a little bit of a conversation going about the Sepher Yetzirah. Dan or Taryn? Dan, go ahead.
Sure, I have one. Isn't it in 777 where Crowley tells us to basically not pay attention to the Sepher Yetzirah a little bit, kind of slights it at the end? What's your?
I would be. I think it's important to not overemphasize moments where Crowley has a certain type of coy irony towards a lot of things, and this is a kind of performance of his personality that I think he's kind of winking a bit, and I think it's a mistake to take it too seriously. I think he took this text very seriously and intends for magicians to do so as well. Basically, is what I think.
Okay, yeah, that's kind of what I felt, so that makes sense. Thank you.
Again, when Crowley is coy in these ways, what he wants to push back on, I think, more primarily is remember where we were talking a few weeks about skepticism, and skepticism is part of the methodology of magic. And the ideal of ancient skepticism is not to be dogmatic. And so I think that the element of playful irony that Crowley often has in his texts is primarily intended to promote the idea among his readers to guard against dogmatism. And that includes the dogmatism of his own writings, and also of the texts that they're looking at in the past, that they should have a kind of open and hermeneutically generous approach to them that doesn't become too bogged down in some kind of fundamentalist search for the truth. And theosophy in particular become extremely dogmatic at this point. And my reading of Thelema is that it's an attempt not just to perpetuate certain theosophical doctrines, but it's also kind of a break with theosophy, particularly theosophical positivism, the ideal of occult science as something that could directly compete with the physical sciences that were going on at the time. Blavatsky, for example, thought that the occult science that she was promoting would supplant Darwinism. And I think, as Crowley, I think, also thought that this is futile, and that's not the right direction to move in terms of what the significance of these ancient texts are. Just as the Bible should not be read as a science textbook, neither should the Sepher Yetzirah, or other texts that aren't part of the Hebrew canon, whether that's Plato or Aristotle or whatever. And all of these texts contain great wisdom, but they've also been supplanted in some way by a better contemporary understanding of the world that we live in. And so, just as I think there's a number of ideas in the Book of the Law that anticipate both special and general relativity, in a way that I think is very interesting. And that just as that supplants classical mechanics of, say, Newtonian physics, in a similar way, Thelema supplants theosophy. Not totally. It's like theosophy is under erasure in this Derridian way, that it's still there as this text, but the way that you interpret it becomes more flexible. Does that make sense? And I go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, definitely makes sense. So, thank you.
Sure, and we should also be aware that Crowley's cultural standards are different from ours with regards to what we would now consider to be ethnically insensitive remarks or attitudes that at his time were just, the way that white Gentiles talked. And so he talks that way too. And so we shouldn't get hung up on that. I think there's a tendency for a lot of liberal progressives in the Thelemic or other community to, when things occur either in Crowley or other texts that are, from our point of view, racially insensitive, and maybe even in the past, we could think of them as racially insensitive too at the time, even back then, that there's a tendency to get hung up on that. And then that's all that we talk about. And then we stop interpreting. We stop looking for the wisdom in the text, or we stop reading, or our ability to read or hermeneutically encounter and be in dialogue with these texts in a way that's going to be meaningful to us gets halted or impeded. And I think it's, of course, important to be aware of these valences. But I think that when we get too moralizing and puritanical in the way that we read and get hung up on these things in a way that we stop them being able to engage with these texts, that conservatives then win, because they can then come along and see, oh, look at these silly liberals who can't read because they keep tripping over themselves to be politically correct, or whatever their terminology is. I hate, by the way, the terminology politically correct, because it's a term that is pejorative, that was coined by conservatives. I don't think it legitimately describes the, I think, very good intentions of people who want to be conscious, speak well of other people civically. You know what I mean? And there's nothing wrong with that. And when people come along and make sneering remarks about political correctness, they're jerks to do that. And I don't approve of that kind of attitude. But nevertheless, the conservative then sort of rhetorically wins, because they then come along and say, look, they've stopped reading. Whereas I, with my more traditional, way of reading, I can come in and I can show how this relates to some kind of orthodoxy that I figured out and decided is the truth. And then these dogmatic or more fundamentalist valences of interpretation can kind of reassert themselves. And I think there's plenty to talk about in these documents or texts where we can also be aware of these pitfalls in reading, particularly the long history of anti-Semitism and Western esotericism. We can be aware of that, but I think it's a mistake to get too hung up on that, because the whole point of being aware of the tradition of anti-Semitism is to find creative and constructive ways to push back against that, or compete with, or place that under erasure in this Derridian way, by being able to encounter and read these Jewish texts, which puts us back into conversation with them, which is a conversation that, again, I want to emphasize, goes all the way back to antiquity. And so we can be, I think it's important to permit ourselves to be part of that conversation in its full complexity, while also being critically aware of, again, these pitfalls and challenges of interpretation. Anyway, Dan or Taryn, do you have anything more to say on that, or anything else? Talk about this text.
Well, would you mind going over a little bit more about Kabbalistic zero? Could you kind of retouch on that a little bit? And just...
Yes, let me do that. So let me put it in terms of, again, this kind of rabbinical style of interpretation. So in contrast to Greco-Roman metaphysics. So The Christian theologian Jürgen Moltmann, I think, has a very interesting interpretation of this sort of interpretive tendency within this theme within the Hebrew scriptures versus the Greco-Roman pagan traditions. So, according to Jürgen Moltmann's reading, Greco-Roman paganism is focused around the experience of the divine through the epiphany of the God. So the divine is experienced through a kind of presence. And Greco-Roman philosophy and ritual is focused around making the object of worship, the divine, present to the worshipers, so that they can hear the oracular voice of the God or have a vision of the presence of the God's body as a human body. And so they worship statues of the gods because that shows the presence of the divinity. Moltmann argues that there's a different theme that's prevalent in the Hebrew scriptures, the national epic, and the history books, the Chronicles, and then also in the tradition of rabbinical interpretation of that later, where instead of epiphany being the basis for encounter with the sacred, instead there's this other different Greek word that's called prolepsis, which means anticipation. So if the condition of the Greek or Roman is to be a kind of imperial political subject where their empire rules the world and then their gods are present to hold up the state, the Jewish experience is being in exile, where your homeland has been lost, has been overrun, has again been, it's under erasure. It's been taken away from you, and you're wandering in exile, like Abraham or Moses in the desert. And so you're in a kind of anticipation of the messianic time to come, where you'll be restored to the homeland. But then it turns out that this time to come that you're in anticipation of, that anticipation also gives you a kind of access to it in the present as well. So there's a kind of, the sacred is encountered through a kind of presence, through absence. So therefore, God's name, you're not to pronounce it. It's too holy to be actually present. Its presence has to be through this kind of absence. God's voice is no longer speaking, but instead you have the writing of the Torah, which is the presence through the absence of God's voice. In the temple in Jerusalem, there's no statue in the Holy of Holies. It's empty. There's the Ark of the Covenant with the mercy seat, but the mercy seat has no image there. In fact, you are prohibited by Torah from making images of God. Why? Because God is presence through his absence. You see how this is different from the Greco-Roman epiphany. So they worship the divine as the presence of this statue that the gods look like human beings. God is too holy to either look like a human being. He's this abyssal absence that's too profound to be grasped. And maybe you can have a vision of him as a human body on the throne, but it's so holy, if you gaze on him, your body bursts into fire because it's so sacred that you can't even look on it. It's like at the end of the Raiders of the Lost Ark, when they open the Ark, what happens? They all burn up, right? That's what happens when you come get too close to God, because he's so sacred, he burns you up because you're not holy enough to be around the sacred abyss of being, you see. So it's this different, it's this interestingly different kind of modality. And so in Thelema, if the moment of epiphany is the knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel, where you have the vision and the voice of your higher divine self able to communicate the gnosis to you. There's also this deeper abyss that lies beyond that, where that epiphany makes you holy enough where you can now cross over and not get burned up. Or you do get burned up, but that's not the real you, because you're beyond the metaphysical unity. There's this Kabbalistic nothingness that is perhaps your ultimate deeper identity, that you can then, if you identify yourself with the Kabbalistic nothingness, you won't be destroyed when you cross the abyss, because when you're destroyed, there's still nothingness left. You see? And so if you're identified with that, you can pass through it and you can reach the supernal reality. And you can have, the Sepher Yetzirah says that by making these permutations, you restore or return God to his throne. Okay, well, that's an odd way of phrasing it, because from the Greek way of thinking about it, the divine would already be on its throne. It wouldn't be absent. It would never be absent. It's an eternal presence, right? That you're then attempting to ascend to. But in Qabalah, you're descending to a kind of abyssal, sacred openness within which the divine inscribes itself through writing, you see. So these are the kind of differences. And so when Crowley talks about the Kabbalistic zero, he's talking about this Jewish Kabbalistic type of signification through magical writing. So when he utters his word as a magus, it's in the form of a text. It's this writing on the page, just like the Torah, right? Is this writing on the page. And then the voice is present through its absence, you see. Where is Iwas? Where is Iwas's voice? At one point, Gerald York says to Aleister Crowley, where's Iwas now? Well, Iwas is the Kabbalistic zero. It's the voice in the silence. But it's the voice in the silence where there is no voice, right? So you see what I mean? So again, it's this reference to this rabbinical style that is for Crowley is this deeper understanding that, he's of course not opposed to all this Greco-Roman magic. He's using that too, but for him, there's this deeper gnosis that's expressed through the specifically Kabbalistic textuality. And so that, in a way, is what he's kind of reintroducing to Western esotericism over and against this sort of theosophical metaphysical positivism, to again place that under erasure, meaning not to simply do away with it, but to add these additional valences of interpretation to make this closed system open again. And so then we're able to practice magic within that particular what Martin Heidegger calls the clearing of being, where you can have these skills and practices that allow you to resacralize your environment, which is alienated from us by the vulgarization of consumer commodity culture, or however you want to articulate or understand that that lack of sacredness in modern life, which is also something that ancient people experience, just in a different way. And so if we can find a way to reinterpret those texts, the way they found to resacralize their experience can also be our way of resacralizing our experience. But I think in modernity, the trap is always to revert to a kind of metaphysical fundamentalism. And that's why I think the concept of the Kabbalistic zero in a Thelemic context is interesting, because it means that Crowley is already aware of this trap, and he's setting up his text to already know how to already have this code, that if you're smart enough to spot it and know how to read it that way, you can keep the system open. And so that's the way that I like to read Thelema. And anyway, that's what I sort of like to promote in this course. It's both a way to look at texts, but also a way to look at the way that we look at texts. Again, a reference to this kind of hermeneutical dimension of practice, hermeneutics, meaning Hermes, the god of magic, and also the god of writing. Again, this magical, this relationship of magic to writing that's deeper than the merely Greek metaphysical understanding, this phonocentric, logocentric understanding of Greek theurgy. So again, it's just a way to think of Thelema as a way that is modernizing ancient theurgy by also critiquing it. So it's reinterpreting rather than just reinstantiating it. It's updating it, not just, trying to return to some kind of fundamentalist understanding of the past. And so that way Thelema is able to be open to new interpretations that are in the future, rather than just a kind of closed reference to the past, which is the trap of theosophy, because it's worshiping this past tradition, the Sophia Perennis, the ancient wisdom tradition. And so it's always looking to the past, whereas Thelema is kind of opening up to the will that is in action, in movement. Remember, Crowley says that magic is a verb, not a noun. Okay, again, that's a reference to this theme of the Kabbalistic zero, because what's a noun? What's the epiphany of the metaphysical unity? The verb is the action, is the prolepsis, is the openness, the anticipation of will to the messianic time, to the utopian horizon of the future, which in that very anticipation can be then anticipated in the present and then experienced again through this kind of presence through absence, or a presence of the divine that we're able to understand also has a kind of absence to it. So it's not totalized, it's open rather than closed, projects us forward rather than just leaving us, worshiping the some kind of epiphany in the present moment that isn't open to the future. And then we're always trying to get back to or worship in the past, or that we don't still continue to have access to in our future. Again, questions, comments from either of you? We want to continue the conversation.
Oh, thank you. That helped a lot, actually. Appreciate it.
Okay, great. Taryn, did you have anything you wanted to add or talk about?
Yeah, I just as we were sort of talking about this sort of the overwriting or rewriting the kind of breaking up what can just simply be presupposed dogmatically. I wanted to go back to your little tangent on sort of like the queering to break up sort of like a fundamental heteronormativity, which I followed everything like in the tangent in itself, like the relation with Newberg and also just Crowley's own, I think, self-actualization sort of sounds a little something, but for lack of a better word. But I was most particularly curious about, like, I somehow missed how you got there from where we were in the text. And so I was just curious about, like, what was it that brought that example to be illustrative?
It
Like,
was
where did we
about
get that?
the intertextuality of the Sepher Yetzirah, where there was a citation from Ezekiel, specifically in verse 6 of chapter 1. And the jump, which I acknowledge wasn't exactly clear in the moment where I started the tangent. The point I'm trying to make is that, again, contrasting, and I'm sort of following the reading of Jacques Derrida here. Again, contrasting this rabbinical Jewish style versus the Greco-Roman rhetoric and the logocentrism of that particular cultural tradition. Another way that you could put this is to counterpose the intertextuality of Qabalah and also Hebrew language writing in general, the Talmud sort of being the great exemplar of that, the intense intertextuality of the Talmud as a kind of conversation with itself, which also involves the Torah, but then it's also the conversation with the conversation about the Torah. And this can be contrasted with a kind of the Platonic emphasis on the transcendence of the ground of meaning. So remember that for Plato, the incompleteness um, of meaning in spoken discourse, he's very unsettled by that because that keeps getting brought up in the Socratic skeptical kind of methodology. The speakers keep winding up in aporia, where they don't understand how they can know anything because the meaning of things that seems so immediate and obvious gets undercut once you start the dialectic, once you start moving terms around and trying to understand how you know things. And then you discover that it isn't grounded in the way that you wanted. And so Greek metaphysics then becomes obsessed with the way that meaning can be grounded in another world. So by projecting or putting meaning in a kind of transcendence that's beyond the world, that's beyond language, then by invoking a kind of grounded meaning that's beyond meaning itself, that is in a kind of hyper meaningful other world, it's difficult to describe it. We're all familiar with this kind of theme of this Platonic trope of the placing the meaning of things in another world, and therefore you're able to establish this ground. Whereas to see things from a kind of intertextual point of view is instead to say, no, there's only language. And the reference of language to itself is what permutates all the many meanings that we could have. Ludwig Wittgenstein says there's many different ways to follow a rule. So if the Greco-Roman thing is let's establish the rules and then we know what the meaning of things are, Wittgenstein, again representing this kind of Jewish excess, comes along and he says, no, even if you get the rules settled, there's many different ways then to follow those rules. So again, you can't ground it. So I think in the case of Crowley, he's trying to break out of the box of the Christian fundamentalist way to pull this Platonic move is to place your faith in the absoluteness of the salvation of Jesus Christ and his ministry. However you frame that, it's a kind of fundamentalist faith that is, again, this faith in this other world, this otherworldly meaning. And so then you have this whole mysticism based on it, where you're always coming up to this kind of apophatic or negative quality to meaning that you then you put into another world, and that's how you're able to ground your meaning. And I think that Crowley is trying to work his way in a complicated way free from that. So in a kind of colonial Christian context, he's bringing himself into dialogue with non-Christian white traditions and doing a kind of deep immersion into that, to look for alternatives to Christian colonial identity. So, for example, in his own case, the Irishness of his family background allows him to identify with, so for example, when goes to the United States, he announces that he kind of renounces his English citizenship and says that he's really an Irishman. And again, just like this is very important, and it also has a kind of queer element as well, because just as Jewishness has a kind of queer signification, Irishness also has this kind of foreign, queer, extra or surplus dimension to it that allows him to construct a kind of post-colonial identity for himself, even as the British Empire is winding up in the world wars and kind of breaking up. And so he's able to explore these excess or surplus dimensions of signification. And he does it through a kind of intertextuality, where Thelema names a space of intertextual dialogue or hermeneutical exchange between this whole range of non-white, non-Christian, non-straight dimensions of signification or literary genres that he can then refer to and synthesize in his own new mode of queer textuality, you see. And so Jewishness and Irishness are elements of that for as he's trying to write his way out of this kind of straight Anglo-white identity that his class identity he kind of inherited from his pre-existing class identity, but now he's trying to find a way to write his way out of. I don't know if that, and so it's linked to this kind of intertextuality. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I think that it sort of comes back to that fundamental idea of that to really understand one's nature and sort of, you know, on the one hand, what he says in the beginning of Magic and Theory and Practice, like where he has all of those what do you call them, aphorisms or whatever, where on the one hand he's sort of saying like you have to only do what it is in your nature to do, but then also how you have to question absolutely everything that could possibly be within your nature to actually understand what your nature is. It's sort of, I don't know, like who said that thing about like you upset the apple cart to then rediscover what apples are, you know?
I don't know, but yeah, exactly like that, right?
Like and so I sort of understand like particularly about how we can look at those examples in Crowley's, you know, own personal journey and life and whatnot, but how this sort of intertextuality it then becomes the reflection that we apply to our own particular apple carts that we need to upset.
Sure.
I guess.
And for Crowley, the big apple cart is the British Christian colonial empire.
Right.
That's why when he's in New York, he rows out to the Statue of Liberty and renounces his British citizenship and that he's now going to support Irish Revolution. And remember that the Irish were in armed revolution at this time to establish what's now the Republic of Ireland. Took until the 20s. It wasn't entirely successful. But remember, there was this post office in Dublin that they took over, and there was this whole uprising. And again, it's to try to break up the British Empire as this colonial hegemony, right? That's this Christian colonial hegemony. And so that's why it's important for Crowley to, in this moment of revolt in Ireland, to say, oh, I'm Irish. So he like symbolically transfers his identity over into this revolutionary position, right? And so in the United States, we kind of forget the subtlety because it's not part of our own national history, some of the subtleties of that. But that's where Crowley's Irishness, it's an actively revolutionary position for him to be in at that time, because what does it mean to say that you're Irish? It means you're in revolt, you're in revolutionary revolt against the British Empire as a Christian colonial project. You see? And so it's this revolutionary, and that's why Crowley's can't be assimilated to conservatism. Why I think this libertarian conservative reading of Crowley is totally wrong, because it doesn't acknowledge his counter-colonial aspect. And that's why we also need to not be tricked when he makes these maybe ethnically insensitive, ironic comments at certain points in his writings. He's just kind of mouthing off, but we need to recognize that his deeper, more authentic identification politically is with the revolutionaries of history. And that's the side he's really on. And so I think we can recognize that also in his writing. We just have to be smart when we're reading to be able to see it. Anyway, we've got about a minute left. Any more quick comments or anything else we want to do just before we're going to sign off? Okay, the next two courses, we're going to return to Neoplatonism with the two major philosophers of late antiquity, Plotinus and Iamblichus, the two most important figures for our own tradition. But because we've had this little detour through skepticism and rabbinical discourse, we now have the critical tools that we need to both appreciate but also critique late Roman Neoplatonism. And that's what we're going to look at over the next 2 weeks as we finish up the course. So thanks everybody for joining us for this week. And I'm going to sign off. So love is the law, love under will.